Now, I've chosen to speak on this subject because as a society, we need to rebalance our presentations towards the age of sail. For the last 3 or so years, there's been a gradual drift to the era of steel and steam. Not that I am disinterested in that area, but we do need to keep a balance. I've chosen the dates 1740 to 1780 since I have built and collected 5 sloops of war, at 1 to 64, covering the period, and they illustrate the 5 main rigs available to these small warships. They are ship rig with 3 masts, brig rig with 2 masts, ketch rig with 2 masts, schooner rig with 2 masts, and cutter rig with 1 mast. Actually, the last is a bit of a cheat, but I will come to that later. There were 3 other rigs, less represented in this period. The Bylander rig, with the main course being a lugsail, the snow rig, of which more later, and the brigantine rig, with a 4-mast square rigged and a main mast fore and aft rigged. And we will look at the 5 in chronological order, starting with the Ketch rig. Now, this is an old rig dating back to the middle of the 17th century and used for a multiplicity of purposes, but mainly fishing and riverine and coastwise trade. So let us look at the sketch of Ketch from 1650 here, a rattan vessel with a very simple rig, but with a fair spread of fore and aft canvas. All that was carried on the aft or mizzenmast was a lateen sail. However, to this was added a square topsail, as seen here in this grisaille by Van der Velde the Elder, which includes the artist himself working under an awning midships. You will note also the tall, narrow bus sail or main course, a useful sail when going to windward, in that it could almost be used like a lugsail. Now, if we fast forward to the middle of the 18th century, and the rig has become complicated, and more powerful. Gone is the tall bus sail, and in its place is a conventional square course. It now sports topgallant sails on main and mizzen, and between them a set of staysails. Also note the vast bowsprit, which allows a massive extent of fore and aft canvas forward of the mast. By this time, staysails were well established. See also the size of the fore and aft mizzen course, the use of a boom, which is not shown here, but it did exist. This would help to balance the spread of canvas right forward. Now, as I'm going to be talking about the problems of setting gaff-headed fore and aft sails immediately behind a mast carrying square sails, I'm going to divert to a rig that was beginning to fade out by this time, like 1750s. A much used rig before the period was the Snow. Now, this is actually from a model of about 1718, where the main and aftermost mast had behind it a vertical spar, or on occasion in the Royal Navy, a stout warp to which the luff of the gaff-headed sail was laced, and on which the throat of the gaff spar rode, thus avoiding any confliction with the handling of the main course yard as it travelled up and down the mast. The sail was loose-footed and without a boom, rather in the manner of the old Thames hoy. The stout warp would have been secured to the top, and been tensioned to an eye-bolt on the deck using either a tackle or a system of dead eyes and lanyards. However, this model of a Ketch rig sloop of 1754, 12 years later than Granado, which we're going to talk about, shows a gaff-headed wing or trysail set after the mainmast. There is no sign of a trysail mast or a warp to take the sail's luff, which makes me think that the luff of the sail may have been left flying free with its tack secured either to an eye-bolt on the deck or to a ring at the foot of the mast. And as we have seen, this placing of fore and aft canvas immediately after the square rig mast is in contrast to the arrangements of the Snow. To illustrate this rig, we can look at it in more detail on a model which, better than any image, lets the onlooker see the run of the rigging and therefore the management of the sails. The model I have chosen is HMS Granado. She was built in Harwich in 1742 as a bomb ketch, but was commissioned as a sloop of war because that was the class of ship required at the time. In fact, she spent most of her career in the sloop of war role. Shipwrights could carry out the conversion from bomb to sloop and vice versa in a couple of days. It's a remarkable feat, and it would have involved a lot of carpentry. Before we look at her rig, there is one feature of deck equipment that puzzled me for a time, but the answer lay in the publication Anatomy of the Ship. You will see a large cocked up black beam thwartships on the foredeck. This is a fish derrick, and it's used for bringing up an anchor out of the water. The leading anchors on each side are raised on permanent cats, but after them on each side is a second anchor with no permanent device in place to hold it up to deck level. Hence the reason for an alternative piece of equipment. The derrick can have its heel secured on either side using a shank shackle, allowing it to raise anchors to port and starboard. The shackle is a bit like a large deck eye boat that can move in upright mode to accommodate the angle of the derrick. When not in use, the derrick will be chopped horizontally and secured across the foredeck. Now let us look up into the rigging.
You will see that from the leading edge of the top, there are a number of lines leading forward to a point on the mainstay. These created an apron that prevented the foot of the topsail engaging with the clutter underneath the top when the topsail was lowered without being reefed. This feature disappeared on minor war vessels towards the end of the century.
Turning to the shrouds, the model maker has used untarred lines or lanyards for the rat lines. Some argue that these also, the lanyards, should be tarred, and that once set up, the lanyards would not need adjustment. I reckon that is probably not the case. Adjustments would always be necessary. The actual rat lines could, of course, be tarred at the edges because, in fact, they became untarred when they were used by the feet of the sailors going up onto the yards. Finally, before we leave this model, there does seem to be one major fact affecting quick engagement by the mortars, and that is the obscuration of the mortar fire by shrouds and backstays, which suggests that these vessels were maneuvered into position, anchored fore and aft with their broadsides facing the target area, then having some of their rigging dismantled before they would be ready to engage. It was not so bad for the mortar placed before the mainmast, but for the one after that mast, there was a veritable curtain of lines blanketing its field of fire. Now, the Ketch rig's use in the Royal Navy did not really outlast the 1750s. Bomb coaches became ship-rigged, and those sloop rigged in this way disappeared also. Now we move to an entirely different scene, the coast of North America. The schooner rig was invented by the Dutch, though there's a good possibility they picked up the idea from the Western Pacific in the 16th or 17th centuries. A useful weatherly rig for the Dutch as it helped in negotiating the shallow channels round their coast and in the canals linking their meres. However, the Americans espoused the rig with gusto, and in doing so, invented the word schooner. Now, this is a scratch-built model of Chaleur 1-64, constructed using plans in Howard Chappell's American sailing ships. This small vessel was bought from the Americans by the Royal Navy in, I think, in 1766. She was the first schooner in this service, and indeed many of the Royal Navy schooners were to hail from this source, most having been captured during the American War of Independence and the War of 1812. Others were bought in the 1760s, notably the Marblehead schooners, for service around Jamaica. The extreme rake of their masts could be seen earlier in the Bermudan sloop, so they heralded from a different stretch of coastline from other notable purchases, such as Halifax and Hannah. Harold Hart was a great exponent of these vessels, as can be seen in his book, The Colonial Schooner. You will see the Marblehead schooner anchored off the quay in this diorama of a New England shipyard. Now, Chaleur is equipped with a lengthy bowsprit, and the lower yards there were jack yards, but they could be used for setting a main and fore course. Her mainstay is secured at deck level with a tackle, which I am uncertain about. If her fore and aft foresail had had a boom for its foot, which I think unlikely, although it was in the plan, a detached mainstay might have been necessary. But if the clew was secured as on a foresail, the sail would have been passed over the mainstay when tacking without having to remove that stay. During the period of virtually continuous naval engagement from 1776 to 1815, the Royal Navy made use of schooner-rigged vessels as advisors, communications vessels. Indeed, His Majesty's schooner Pickle of Trafalgar fame was one such, but this is outside our period. Now, back eastwards across the pond, we come in the 1770s to a large class, about 30, of very attractive sloops with ship rig. And this is HMS Fly, built from an Amati kit of 1 to 64. She was designed, I think, by Williams, surveyor to the Navy at the time. These sloops formed the main force attempting to blockade the traffic of arms from reaching Washington's forces in New England. They would have done better, but as usual, the British Admiralty had decided to ignore the value of the minor war vessel. They needed 100 for the job. The Admiralty were to do this again in both world wars for different reasons, though they did get sloop production right in the fight against France from 1893 to 1815. There is nothing unusual about this rig, but it is worth comparing to the earlier ship-rigged sloops. The first ship-rigged sloops were purchased in the 1740s from a commercial yard, but the first one designed by the surveyor at the time, Sir Thomas Slade, in the 1750s, was HMS Favourite. By then, the Navy was in the habit of converting snow or brig-rigged sloops to ship-rig, and you can tell this in the spacing of the masts, one from the other, is different, with the main and the mizzen being unnaturally close together, as we see here. This example, La Guirlande, was a French privateer brig brought into the Navy in the 1750s and converted and given an uprated armament. And you can see how close the mizzen and the main are. The same happened with HMS Pelican. This is not a very good model and was not made by me. It was the second command of Sir Edward Pellew, later to be Lord Exmouth. She was originally a French privateer brig. He didn't like her, and she did not handle all that well. A poor conversion to ship rig, perchance. But again, you can see the masts close together. Note that HMS Fly still has crow's feet from the tops of the stays. This feature would shortly disappear. Why? Possibly improved materials obviated the need. Note also that the loose-footed fore and aft sail has disappeared in favour of a full spanker with boom. Now, the next model from a Vanguard kit is a bit of a cheat. HMS Alert was a cutter with clinker-laid planking below the whale launched at Dover in 1777. Her first commander was a lieutenant, and her first engagement was against the 16-gun American brig Lexington, which she captured, not least because the Lexington ran out of ammunition when she had to lower her colours. On account of this inglorious victory, the captain of the Alert was promoted from lieutenant to master and commander. This rank normally attracted a sloop of war as a command. So their lordships decided in their wisdom to promote the cutter to sloop. The fact that her one mast has 4 spars is of interest. The top spar carried the top gallant sail, which you can see on the left top, and seen here on this slide, the next one down carried the topsail and acted as a yard to take the sheets of the top gallant sail. The third carried the square main course, and the fourth, set abaft the main course, acted as a jack yard to take the tack and clew of the topsail, whose foot presents a deep roach. Now we move to the early brig sloops. HMS Speedy, built by Thomas King and commissioned at Dover just outside our period in 1782. Coming from Dover, her hull lines are close to the cutters being built at that port. She came to fame under the command of Master and Commander, the Lord Thomas Cochrane. In 1802, off the European coast of the Mediterranean, she attacked and took a 32-gun frigate sailing under a Spanish flag. This action is related to the first of the O'Brien Aubrey Maturin series of books, Master and Commander. This kit by Vanguard models at 1 to 64 can be turned into a really excellent model, but beware, the rigging is complicated. HMS Speedy's rig of brig sloop had evolved from the earlier snow rig sloops, whose rig fell out of favour with the Navy towards the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. From then on, sloops were classified either as brig sloops or ship sloops. You will have noticed that this model does not present crow's feet from the tops of the stays, though her build date coincides with the period of the end of their use. The other point to note is that on a brig, the main course yard was fixed, so that there was no need for a trysail mast above the mainmast. Now, to wind back to a point before the period we are studying, we can see the snow rig from which the brig sloop evolved. Here we have one of the ferret class of sloops, which were built in 1710 to 1711. They were originally single-masted sloops destined for Jamaica. They had been returned to England by 1718 and were then re-rigged as snows. You can see here the trysail mast standing immediately abaft the mainmast. This model was in the Science Museum, South Kensington, but has since been reclaimed by the descendants of the owner. Now, the snow rig also applied to the cruiser class of sloops of 1752, as is seen here of HMS Cruiser sailing in company with another of her class, HMS Speedbowl, but the latter with a Ketch rig. And with this picture of them tacking off the Dodman in Cornwall and being represented as the last snows and ketches, this presentation ends. Thank you.